Good. Aubrey represents the very best of Pittsburgh. The energy, the enthusiasm, the sense of what you can be when everything is so focused on excellence. And I'm here because I like Pittsburgh. I have a history with Pittsburgh because much of what I do today in computer science was invented here many years ago. And I've always thought that as an industrial model and as a place of innovation, it's very hard to find other really good choices. It's some combination of how the government here works, the universities work, and the notion of the pragmatism born of Westinghouse and Mellon and all of the great people from years ago are all imbued deeply in the culture. And what I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about sort of the preamble to the G20 and a little bit about technology and what's going to happen, and then have your questions and comments. You know, to putting into perspective, everybody shows up tomorrow, the meetings are Thursday, Friday, and then everybody leaves. And there's a lot of concerns about growth globally. There's a lot of concerns about many, many things. We're all familiar with them. You've all seen all the stories. And these are hard jobs. I don't envy the leaders their tasks. They have to sort all of this out in an even more difficult political climate, shaky markets, lots of uncertainty, and so forth. But I want to bring some light to this. I want to bring some more realistic assessment as to where we are, and also give you a sense of what the future looks like. There's a quote from Alvin Toffler, who some of you may remember who he is. He described the great growing engine of change, technology, as it's the impact on economic growth. And I think we often think that somehow moving money around is economic growth, or buying and selling established companies that are growing for ever higher prices. Well, that's growth, isn't it? Because we added the value that they did. Growth occurs because of private sector investment and innovation, building new products and services that people care about. That's how growth happens. It doesn't happen because of more government spending or more inflation of the currency or whatever. Real growth, sustainable growth, comes from the investment in businesses and services that we all take advantage of. And so part of that is a fundamental focus on technology, and the kind of cutting-edge technology that makes you uncomfortable because it's so disruptive, because it changes things. It causes current models to be changed, right? They fall by the wayside, and a new model, a more interesting, more direct model emerges. And it seems to me that this is all happening so quickly that we haven't really quite figured out how it's changing our society, and I want to talk about that as well. So the venue of Pittsburgh seems to me particularly appropriate. When Pittsburgh was originally chosen, everybody said, oh, why would you choose Pittsburgh? Pittsburgh is a great story, right? The whole notion of going from sort of a steel city to a producer of high-tech alloys, you know, titanium. My dentist, who I visited yesterday, explained to me that dentists invented titanium because it's the one thing that your bones grow around, and everybody loves it, and they've been doing this for 50 years. Titanium is this incredibly important thing. Didn't exist before. The healthcare system that you all have here with UPMC, now the #1 employer, the unemployment rate being much lower than the national averages, especially given the sort of tough economic travails that you've been through over the last 10 years. So it seems to me that the nice thing about this is you've got a situation where the rising powers, the sort of G20 inclusive, are now all here to see a success model for a democracy which blends both the old and the new in a particularly clever way. So there are lots of laws that people talk about when they talk about technology, and I'd like to introduce a new one which I'm going to call Gutenberg's law, which I'll make up roughly like this. History has demonstrated that there's a direct correlation between the amount of information available to the average citizen and economic growth and the progress of that citizen's country. And almost everything we deal with in the negative or positive context has been because of time compression, because of all of this information. And the more information that's available, the more smart people can act on it. And I'm one of these people who believes that there's smart people everywhere. here, there, and other countries and other races and other religions and so forth. They're all there too. And so in the global competitive model, it's not so much that the fact that you have an industrial policy, it's that you have an openness about information and that you use the information tools. And the good news is that the statistics and so forth all favor what we're doing so well, so very much. If you look at the printing press, for example, the impact that it had on completely changing the understanding of what was at the time a very small number of people who were even literate, the telegraph moving the original sort of Twitter model of the world, fast-moving news, spreading wildfire, stocks going up and down, crises and so forth and so on, and telephones and the gift of email, having us always be in touch, even if we don't really want to be. But all of these are basically communications, and if you look, what's happened is that the cycles of society have accelerated, the ups and downs, all because of the transparency and the connectedness of all of us. It used to be that your regional model was local, now it's global. We now respond to things in a global context that we would have never even known about 10 or 20 years ago because of the rise of all of this. There's a lot of evidence that this is true. There's a study that the ICT sector, which is essentially computers and telephony, represents in Europe 5% of European GDP, but it drove 40% of overall growth and 25% of overall growth and 40% of the increase in productivity. So not only is this happening, but the jobs that are being created are accelerants. They're high paying, they have a lot of leverage. If you have a choice of a job to fund, if you're a government official, you would do one of these. Another World Bank study, but 10 percentage points of increase in high-speed internet access, economic growth was 1.3 percentage points. And for countries where economic growth is negative or 1 or 2%, that's a huge number. So this stuff works, and it works because of globalization of information, globalization of markets. Now this is all happening in the backdrop of what the physicists are doing, and the physicists continue to make our networks and our computers that much faster. Japan leads in the speed of broadband. The average Japanese city dweller has a 160 megabit connection, which is inconceivable to us here. The new DOCSIS 3 standard here in the US is capable of generating 50 megabits per second, so that's pretty good. That manages to bring us to the 13th in the world in terms of broadband penetration. Not so good for America, the leader in technology. But this is a wonderful revolution because everybody is benefiting. Even Africa, we're putting in new cables and so forth. And the data that is being generated as a result of everybody being connected is overwhelming. An interesting number here is that this is an IDC number, 487 exabytes of digital information, and I'll tell you what that is in a sense. SAC was created in 2008. That's double from 2007. Today, we're generating about 1 zettabyte. A zettabyte is 10 to the 21st power of bytes, which is a very, very large number. To put this in context, we estimate that the data generated by all of humanity from the inception of humanity to 2003 was about 5 exabytes. So we have generated the entire world's humanity of information between our birth as humans in 2003 in the last 2 days. This is an explosion, and it's an explosion with very, very far-reaching implications for all of us. And you all know this. Everybody here has a mobile phone with you, and you probably won't get it to more than a few inches from you, right? And you would never let anyone use it unless you knew where it was, right? When did this happen to us? When did we become so slave to our mobile phones? In the last few years, huh? There were 77 million smartphones sold last year. That number globally will eventually be in the hundreds of millions and these are sophisticated phones. There's more than 3 billion mobile phones of any kind. 10 years from now, when my grandson is 14, it will be possible that the systems will be at least 100 times more powerful. It will be possible to have all music ever recorded on the equivalent of an iPod. In 15 years, it'll be possible to have 85 years of video on your iPod, which means you'll die before you watch it all. It's like the ultimate sort of frustration device, right? So, and this is another speaking of young people, a very alarming statistic. The study that I read indicated that the average teenager is now going to send 10,000 text messages per year. Now that's an awful lot of time texting, trust me. I guess now I sound like my parents who were worried that I was watching too much television. The scale of Facebook and social networks is phenomenal, being connected, and it gives you this appearance of being connected to everyone. Historically, you knew 100 or 200 people in your tribe, and now you feel like you're a global citizen. So imagine what you can do with that. You can now sit there with your mobile phones and you can vote real time for the performance that you're seeing. A Woodstock of today, you'd have instantaneous feedback as to whether you should get that guy off the stage or not. And community crowdsourcing would be used to determine an awful lot of things of what would happen next. So what happens as a result is we have these resources that can do amazing things. You can find interesting errors. And my favorite current example is that in 1973, the Navy in San Diego decided to build a building. And they built this building, and it just happens to be the shape of a Nazi swastika. Now, nobody noticed this for 25 years, because you can't really see the building from above it. And Google Earth comes off, and everyone says, oh my God, right? We have built a building in the shape of this horrendous and terrible symbol. So they then spend a whole bunch of money to change the shape of the building from the satellites. Now, my reaction, by the way, was like, didn't they notice this when they're doing the plans in 1973? But that's a story for another day. People were using Google Earth, and they were looking, and they discovered a part of a jungle in southern Africa that had never actually been visited. And they sent in basically an investigation, and the whole team went in, and they found all sorts of animals and plants that no one had ever heard of. This is unbelievable in the last year. It gives you a sense of how big the world is and how powerful it is. And in the same case, what's happening is all of these people are spending all of their time contributing stuff to each other. And so the information that you get is now more likely to be from your friend or person to person, user to user. We finally have now seen the breakdown of the traditional hierarchy of single individual to broadcast. The majority of information that you get every day, the way you hear and the heuristics and the judgment that you make are from what your friends generate or what your peers recommend. And that's another permanent and important change in how our society works. So imagine a situation now where you collect all that information. I mean, I would like to see the equivalent of Wikipedia for the doctors, where the doctors, instead of sort of saying, oh, well, I've seen 5 patients that have the same thing, they have a resource which codifies all of medical knowledge in one place collaboratively, which they can then say, these are the sum of all the cases, and this is what standard care is. You can do all sorts of crowdsourcing for real-time information, weather, pollution, crowds, this flash mob, so forth and so on. And you can do truly personal search. Remember what I read yesterday. Remember what I know. Don't tell me things I already know. Tell me something I don't know. And those technologies are available today. You can walk down, when you walk down the street with your mobile phone, because the mobile phone, remember, isn't really a phone. It's a GPS, a video camera, a still camera, a browsing device, and you could talk on it too. Walk down the street, it can tell you everything that happened on the street if you love the history of where you are. It can suggest where you go. It can predict where you will be. So this means a lot of changes for the way government works, and I want to explore that a little bit. If you look at the Obama campaign, and I was a little bit involved in that, they organized both a powerful website and a powerful field marketing program. And that model, right, a field organization as well as a powerful website is probably the new model going forward. 25% of the people who pulled a lever for Obama on election day had already connected to the campaign. Pretty interesting. So now you've got the same ability to connect to things real time. So, for example, car auctions. You really can find out the price of a car. eBay is now, for example, carrying car manufacturers. You can find the true market price as opposed to that negotiated price with that car salesman that you don't really like anyway. You can do all sorts of price comparisons. There's an application for Android, which is a phone that we offer. It's available for many people now, where you can take a picture of a barcode while you're in the store and tell you if it's cheaper online. Pretty interesting. a real consumer benefit, not such a good thing for the shopkeeper. And can you imagine a situation where the government and the people who write reports to the government, we could actually figure out if anyone reads these reports? You know how you go and you get, I produced this report and I produced this survey, and my thought is like, nobody reads this stuff. Well, now we can find out what they actually read. Did anyone read all that research you did? And if the answer is no, maybe you should get a different line of work. All of a sudden, this notion of real-time tracking becomes useful for a lot of things that we take for granted. You can actually figure out who influenced the outcome now with real data, as opposed to all of the heuristics that we always talk about. And we're all convinced of things without any facts whatsoever. And imagine a situation where the government itself changed. And what it did is instead of, for example, announcing the stimulus package, which in general I was in favor of, over a two-year period, the government said, we're going to do this for 3 months, we're going to measure the outcome, and we're going to iterate. And then we're going to iterate again, and then we're going to iterate again as we see what works. Because we can do real-time data now of the economy, of what people are doing, of what people are thinking, and of what people are reading, we really can know questions that we have to estimate from our friends, and we can do it scientifically. So when you instrument the world, another example, healthcare, contentious debates over and over again. We should know the answers to these questions. If we got all the computers linked together in such a way that we knew the aggregate information, not the personal details, but the aggregate information of what people were doing, we could accurately estimate every one of these scenarios, every one of the 535 modifications of the bill. We could do them instantaneously, or more properly, the press and the analysts could do, and we could get a more accurate idea of what's really going to happen with these very, very important political and policy decisions. Had we done the same thing, we would have known this horrendous financial crisis. We would have seen it coming. The computers knew that they were overextended. We didn't ask them. And in some cases, these computers knew one thing and these computers knew another, and the two computers weren't connected. Had we been transparent and open, we could have avoided the horrendous pain that the globe has gone through, or at least some of it. And let me tell you, it has been painful for an awful lot of people. It was a disservice to them to put through them when we could have done it differently. So if you take the trends of instantaneous information, the explosion of information, this personal information, and this real-time nature, this has a lot of implications for business as well. Hal Varian, who's an economist at Google, our chief economist, in fact, he calls this time a period of combinatorial innovation. It's not any one thing that did it. It's the system of innovation, and it's innovation here, 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 all working together, going as fast as they probably can. The example that he uses, which I like, is that this is analogous to what happened to standardizing of mechanical parts in the 19th century. When you standardized mechanical parts, all of a sudden you had interchange. You could repair things and things like that. And it wasn't a single company that standardized on mechanical parts. It just sort of happened because it made good sense to the smart people who were alive at the time. Standardized electronic parts in the 20th century, the same thing. We're doing the same thing with standardized internet components. And that standardization has now made it possible. So what happens is that this lowers the data barriers to entry enormously for innovation. This is another point that is completely missed in the policy debate. Now, Audrey, who I said I view as sort of a national resource, articulates very clearly something very fundamental. When you want to see innovation, you'll see it in these creative communities, typically near coffee shops, little companies that have banded together, small groups of people who have a mission, and they try something, and they try something, and they try something. Pittsburgh is a good example of this, but there are many other places in the United States that have this characteristic, parts of Seattle, parts of San Francisco, parts of New York, parts of Cambridge and Boston, and so forth. You know the list. But my point is that if you want to look for the face of innovation, don't look for a tower with the sign innovation on it. Look instead for this messy, creative, unstructured, interesting, full of creative people kind of a model, because that's how innovation really occurs. And that's where the innovative people will ultimately go. So what happens is that this creates the opportunity to do businesses which I'm going to call micro multinationals, These are 10 people who see themselves serving a global audience. This was not possible until this generation of internet technology, because you literally couldn't reach them. You couldn't advertise, you couldn't get the points out, you couldn't make it happen. And these are the businesses that are going to create the jobs that will get us to where we need to go. And what's happening, of course, is that as we lower the entry price, there are also advertising models. Google, of course, has pioneered this, where a lot of money is going to these small companies, which allows them to get to the next stage and see how big they can really get. And another phenomena has been the rise of the cloud. The technology people call this cloud computing. For those of you who don't know what it means that the computers are managed by the professionals, and your computer, you just turn it on and it uses the network and it gets everything that it needs. And instead of spending all your time managing your personal computer and wondering, did I back that thing or something, it's all taken for you. So the opportunity that we all have is to let people manage these huge data centers. Google is in this business, as are many others, and you can do what you do best, which is to use computers to solve interesting information and entertainment problems. So this rise of the cloud and the opportunity is actually a large business in and of itself, because companies are now moving one after the other from the old model, the PC-centric, mainframe-centric model, to this new cloud computing model, where everything is managed by others, and they, again, spend their time working on business processes and things like that. The potential for cost savings, by the way, is a factor of 10, and so forth and so on. People really care a lot about that. And what's interesting about this phenomena as a result is that, if you go back to the micro multinationals, is that size isn't such a big barrier to entry before. There's an interesting statistic that there were more than 452,000 bloggers in the United States under, this is a Wall Street Journal count, and I suspect it's even low. And these are the number of people who say that blogging is their primary source of revenue. That's pretty amazing. What's interesting is that that's even more than the number of lawyers we have in our country. So think about it. And of course, one's growing much faster than the other. So this is a permanent shift in the economics of our world around us. It means an awful lot of people are dependent upon these systems, and we're going to hear their voices, and I think that is absolutely wonderful. Now, this, of course, is not unique just to the U.S. I'm giving U.S. examples, but in India, for example, the mobile operator is using mobile phones and having farmers to remotely monitor and switch on their irrigation pump sets, right, so they can water, and so forth. And you sit there and you say, that's no big deal. For them, it's life or death. If they don't get the water, they don't get their farming. They don't get their farming, they literally die, because there's no. So it's very, very real. You go on and on and on, and I've got example after example. So what happens when this is done? So remember, here's the model. Mobile phones everywhere, data everywhere, this huge scalability. What does the world look like? Well, I assert to you something which will seem obvious. Humans will continue to do what humans do best, which is to be human. All the things that we know, creative, intuitive, paradoxical way that we are. And you know what I'm talking about. Well, what will computers be good at? They'll be good at remembering everything, to recognize everyone, to know where everyone is, to predict the short-term future, and to continue to beat us in chess. Right? Think about it. All those things involving rote memorization, calculation, and so forth, we're not very good at. And even the best professionals forget those, but computers never forget. And what happens when this happens, when all of this gets put together, is that our world becomes more ambiguous, that the world becomes more shades of gray. And the reason is that you can now finally suck in all of the perspectives. It won't be a simple good guys, bad guys, us versus them. And the kind of leaders I think we have in this room who will do very, very well are the ones that flourish in ambiguity. We're not so sure. We think we did this, we thought this, and so forth. Those are uniquely human characteristics. And the great leaders of the future will handle them in particularly good ways. And what happens at the same time, and I don't want to be so completely Pollyanna here, is that it gets harder because of sophisticated techniques to know exactly what the truth is. Now, Google is in the business of trying to produce the very best search results, but we don't claim to know what the truth is. But legitimate truth groups ones that are actually trying to get a real message out, will have to battle with well-funded, targeted, literally people trying to deceive. Because it will be in their economic incentive to do. This is known as spin, by the way. It's not something that we're inventing anytime here. It's been around for 100 years. But in these new networks, it will be possible to spread disinformation as quickly as to spread information. And if you're a targeted attacker, you might find that that is particularly beneficial to whatever your cause is. And what's interesting is that it'll be possible to do clever forgeries. And smart people will figure out how to trick people with these clever forgeries. And all of us will have to learn how to deal with that, how to detect it, and hopefully how to not be influenced by them. And what's interesting is that in a world of essentially perfect copies, people will be quite happy with a copy of an original because the digital copies will be so good. So that has a lot of implications for how the content and media worlds work. And I'd love to tell you that in this new world, because it's so brilliant, we have all these smart computers and all these smart people, and we're also incredibly educated and wonderful, that there will be fewer bubbles. But in fact, there will be more bubbles. The bubbles will be higher and faster and up and down, because it's true of all markets. Markets are not perfectly rationally stable, but they'll be up and down and up and down and up and down, and we'll all have to get used to that. And we'll all have to figure out how we want to get through life with it. I'm not saying it's good, but I'm saying it's going to be true. So how in this situation, how could we react to this? How do we feel about it? And I'll tell you that the only answer I've been able to come up with, that we at Google have been able to come up with, is about transparency. That in the situation that I'm talking about, open government, open activities, open standards, open networks is really the only way. Anytime you start to partition or withhold things or so forth, you get yourself into trouble because information hiding is ultimately a bad thing in these sort of open networks. There are lots and lots of examples of this, the growth of the internet itself, the rise of Linux, the rise of Wi-Fi, all the things that we take for granted today really came out of this fundamental principles, which have been around for a long time. The internet is a very, very good example of this. As you know, the internet was developed by DARPA, originally for university components, and then eventually commercialized in a very clever way in 1991. Another thing that people should do is they should stop consuming energy and start consuming data. That if you think about it, all of the issues we face with climate change can be addressed in many, many ways by much smarter use of information to control and use our energy. And climate change is clearly between nuclear power, deadly nuclear power, the two really great threats to the world going forward. So here we have a situation, if you go back, we have real-time data, we have everything connected and so forth. We can actually run real-time experiments. We have the power to collect and analyze data in real time all over. And I think this change is one that we'll all have to get used to because I think it's a good one. That we're going to use computers and use information to be more careful with how we use the most precious resources we have all around us. Everybody's going to be a critic in this new model. You know, we went from sort of the Nielsen box to everybody's a YouTube critic. People are using hybrid auto drivers that you can have your little diagram of your gas efficiency. So all of a sudden, people are going to be watching and measuring these things at a level that we've never really seen before. And what happens is that you get these open networks in place, and you can do some amazing things. So why are we not using the batteries that are in our cars to backstop the smart grid in the middle of the afternoon on a hot summer day? Those batteries are just sitting there idle. All that energy is sitting there. You can charge them up at night. Well, the technology exists, and the networks are being built, and they're open enough that you can build, and people here in Pittsburgh are in fact building the components of that powertrain, the powertrain not inside your car, the powertrain from your car back into the grid to help us with some of our climate and energy issues and save another coal-fired plant. Another thing that we can do is take advantage of the fact that the network is powerful, more powerful than your computer. Remember, behind that network is literally millions and millions of computers and servers that have a lot of interesting data that you can figure out. You can open up opportunities for businesses and governments, entrepreneurs, can build systems that can monitor and measure and detect new things. And this is going to happen now with so many people having mobile phones in very, very powerful new ways. You're going to have to adapt and evolve. Now, I don't need to say this in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's story is a perfect example of this. In 2003, when the city was in very dire financial straits, you actually reduced the size of your government sector. You made really, really hard and painful decisions, probably then setting up the growth that has occurred since then. Was it worth doing it? It was sure painful at the time. I remember when this was going on. But what I like about this now is you're seeing the benefit. You're seeing the uptick of all of that hard work that you did five and more years ago. Let's make sure that the principle that's established in this dialogue is that extremists don't win. And there's extremists in all categories. I'm not picking any particular extremist group. Let's make sure that we use the collective wisdom of us to understand what is good and what is valid, and let's have both the decency and the proper approach to try to get to the bottom of what the real truth is on any particular issue. In our country, and in many Western countries, we have a tradition of openness which has really helped us. And the government, in particular the federal government now, has instituted many, many principles of trying to put real-time information out there so people can literally see what the government is doing. The Obama presidency has, for example, already promised to fully identify all the aspects of the federal budget. In addition to that, President Obama on Monday outlined an innovation agenda that called for the full funding of NSF and DARPA and the other things. The impact of those decisions over a 10 or 20-year period is phenomenal. Because after all, where will the growth come from in America? It's not going to come from high-volume, low-wage manufacturing jobs. It's not going to come from the service industries selling to ourselves unless there's an economic structure that will generate the returns, that will generate the demand that can satisfy the service industries. It's going to come from industries like advanced manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing jobs here in America using very sophisticated basically manufacturing lines. And not just in physical goods also. There are technologies such as nanotechnology where such manufacturing plants, which look a lot like an office building, produce tremendously interesting new products and also very high-wage jobs. This is where the growth is going to be. So from my perspective, and I want to put this into perspective for all of you and then take your questions, you have all of these things put together, right? You have this change occurring very quickly. I think in many cases, more quickly than we've really assimilated. The empowerment of individuals, the rise of real time, the collection of all of this data, the ability to answer the questions that I'm talking about in new and very, very fascinating ways. I think it's wonderful. When I put it in a backdrop of innovation, I see the story I'm telling as a key component of how America will grow out of this recession, which we hope is ending and which many people think is already. The growth is going to come not by moving more money around between the banks, which we're particularly good at, by the way. The growth is going to come from the investments and the decisions that are being made in cities like here and by groups like this. There's no question that we face serious threats in our economy. It's obvious. But there are sensible strategies to address this. And I think one of the strategies is optimism. Literally, when people feel better, they invest and they get better. So it's not as simple as just a math problem. It is about feeling. It is about feeling confidence that you know you can get through it. And at the low point, the stimulus package and other things that were done by the governments around the world really did have a way of jump-starting, and it really did work. There's a quote that I like. It's from de Tocqueville in 1831. America is unique because of its abundance of land, its absence of a king, and its democratic and egalitarian institutions and values. From my perspective, this story, the story I'm telling, reflects the possibility of newness, new places, new people with a chance to be heard, new institutions that must sort of earn and re-earn their relevance. That's the challenge that everybody faces, every government, every CEO, every citizen. And I think we have a lot of reasons to be optimistic. Here we are in Pittsburgh, which has a great story. I personally believe very much in the genius of the American people. When I look at my own story, when I look at my colleagues' story, if I look at the story of my industry, what I see is creativity and the power of technology and the genius of people working hard in small groups doing clever things. What I would suggest is our message as our leaders show up basically tonight and tomorrow is for them to look around and try to figure out where's the growth going to come from, and it's going to come from exactly here and exactly in this right way. And I'm excited to be part of that. So thank you very, very much. I think, Audrey, did you want to do questions?
We're good if we could just line up and there are questions.
Yeah, we have
mics there.
We have some mics.
Yeah.
And,
Hey, hello. Test. Okay.
yes, yes.
So I'm wondering.
I can see you're just going to jump right in, so please jump right in.
Jump right in.
Okay. So I've been wondering where Google's position on the long term would be in the stream of innovation, especially if I was an investor, I would be able to. I would see the how do you say it, the opportunity to promote your own products with the to promote your own products while you promote your search and all the other services, even closer to at the customer. And now what I've been reading approximately, well, let's say, I think it was 2 months ago on the Weird News, maybe you know about this, most probably, I think. There it said, it was discussed that there might be the possibility of an antitrust case against Google, similar to the Microsoft, similar as it happened to Microsoft, because of this overall position close to the customer with the opportunity of promoting your own, let's say, for instance, product search, which will give you a good opportunity to increase your revenue. Or let's say promoting YouTube directly in front of your search gives you also one of those opportunities, even directly and closer to the customer, similar as it happened with, let's say, Internet Explorer and the Microsoft case. Maybe you can comment on that? That would be really great.
Yeah, I think I understand your question. Could Google do the kinds of illegal acts that Microsoft did or was found guilty of This is the question you asked, right?
I neither said that Google would be, that Microsoft did something illegal, nor I just say that the opportunity is there, and
they were found guilty. Trust me.
Okay.
Use your favorite search engine; you'll find the details. You'll find them on Bing as well. The rough answer is no, and the simple answer, the sort of longer than no answer, is that. We run Google on a set of principles which have to do with end user benefit, and we're careful not to advantage one property over another because it would screw up consumer benefit. So we in fact show all the other properties. We don't integrate particularly well. We're careful about that for the reasons that you outlined. The antitrust question is actually slightly different. Microsoft was found guilty of essentially tying one thing to the other. And they were essentially blocking competitors. Because we're not that kind of a platform, we don't have that kind of market power. In Google's case, if we were to begin to do that, it would be trivial for you to switch to a competitor, for example, Microsoft. It's much harder to switch from a platform like Windows to somebody else. At Google, we're literally one click away.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Hi. I'd be interested in hearing your vision for Google Ventures and also your thoughts on the open internet provisions that were introduced by the FCC chair a couple of days ago.
Thank you. Google has created a venture arm called Google Ventures. It's an experiment from our perspective. We have lots of cash, as you know, because you have a large cash portfolio. And we decided that we wanted to invest in the technology area, both to get a financial return, of course, but really to help accelerate the kinds of technologies that eventually Google benefits from. So it's too early to say how successful it's going to be, but we're definitely investing. But we're investing very similar to other venture companies. So think venture company. On Monday, the chairman of the FCC, Julius Janikowski, announced a set of principles around net neutrality. And those principles were very similar to what President Obama, then as candidate Obama, announced when he was at Google about 1.5 years earlier. And the rough summary is that net neutrality is about making sure that a particular kind of content is not treated differently from another similar kind of content by the operator. And the scenario that people are worried about is that the carrier, for example, has a vested interest in a particular video, and so they discriminate in favor of that video and against another video from a third party who wants to use the same transport. And in general, obviously Google supports that restriction. We are careful to say that we want to do that within the same category. So there's a very legitimate concern from the operators that if they couldn't discriminate at some level, they could be flooded by bad bits. And we understand that. We just want to make sure that if there's a particular category, say video as an example, that they do not unduly favor their own over alternatives that are coming in. If they were to do that, and I'm not saying that they have, but if they were to do that, it could prevent startups from being able to come in and get their content on the net. So we're strongly in favor of what the FCC is proposing, and we're happy to work with them to make sure that the regulations, as they are ultimately adopted, reflect what I just said.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
So my question relates more to something that you said earlier in your speech, which was kind of thought-provoking. It seemed like it was a rather idealistic solution proposed with the collection of all of the information. Like it's the citizen's responsibility to sort of respond to things that they feel powerful about, to collect all that data, to collect the statistics that say, we want this to happen, we want this change. But I just wanted to clarify, whose responsibility is it to enforce or make that change? Is it the government? Is it big corporations? Like once all this data is collected, I like what you said earlier actually, where you said in your report, who's reading this information? So we have all this information that's been compiled. Who's reading it? Who's saying, oh, the people are expressing this as their goal? Who is going to make the change?
Well, I would start answering by saying that I think we should have a moment of pity or compassion for our elected leaders, who we are busy sort of yelling at all the time. Because imagine if you're one of them, and imagine trying to figure out what the legitimate people's voice is today, in between the specialized groups and the bloggers and the interest groups and the lobbying and the surveying. It'll give you a headache. And furthermore, it occurs on a 24-hour news cycle, so it occurs every hour, and you have to sleep some number of hours per day. So it's almost an impossible job. You're never satisfied. You're never on top of the issue. And we need to develop a sense of where the body politic is, and then the politicians will make that decision. The principle of transparency says that we collect the data, and illegitimate and legitimate groups will use that data. But the data should be open, especially data that government decisions are made of everyone. And I would tell you that all of the really important decisions are hard decisions, and they're shades of gray. They really are. And I think that if we look at issues like war, for example, which everybody has an opinion about, we would be better informed with more information, more analysis, more public discussion, more data analysis of what's going on this political issue or this political behavior or this group or this, or are they a threat and that kind of stuff. So I think you can replicate that over and over and over again. We're better served by more transparency, more people looking at it, more people measuring it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi. When do you think cloud computing will help non-IT industries focus on their core competencies without having to worry about security and other issues like that?
It's happening now. What happens today is many people are using, for example, email systems that are outsourced, so they don't have to run their data servers anymore. There are companies that do VMware as an example of a company that does virtual machine outsourcing, where you can actually run your computers on the internet and have the image look like it's inside your computer. Companies are generally trying to get rid of their data centers and have somebody else own their data centers. This, by the way, is not a new phenomenon. It was true for IBM personal computers 15 years ago, and people would literally have somebody else run IBM mainframes, and it was called mainframe virtualization. So my view that this is an inexorable shift from the old model to the new model. It's highly beneficial to corporations. And they're doing it, by the way, not out of some altruistic goal. They're doing it because it's cheaper. You get better reliability. The security stuff is largely now solved.
Thank you.
Hi. Actually, my question is on cloud computing too. So I'm actually writing a paper on how cloud computing is better for smaller businesses and startups as opposed to bigger businesses. And I was wondering if you could comment on the same.
Well, if you were to start a company today, and maybe you will when you finish writing your paper, what computers would you have to buy? Well, you'd have to buy some laptops. I prefer the Mac, but you could also buy PCs or what have you, and you'd need an internet connection. And everything that you did, you could do on a server. Let's go through the list. You have to pay people, you have a payroll. You have to get customers, well, you can use Google AdWords, sorry for the plug, to advertise your product, whatever widget that you're building. And that's much more efficient than hiring the salespeople and building all the computers to do all that. You do much of your manufacturing can be outsourced, all your email, all your services, all your communication, all your marketing, and all your production. So if you're a small company, it makes no sense to have any computers except for the computers that are on people's desktops. That's a huge change. Huge, huge change, and I think that illustrates the point you should make in your paper.
Yeah, but the thing is, what I mainly see in all the marketing stuff that I saw both on Google and the other cloud computing providers is that all the offerers don't focus in on the niche thing that they actually offer, which is, I saw that one cloud is better for processing, whereas the other is better in terms of storage. So, which is why I came up with the startup point that, particular startups need particular things. And why is it that the companies don't focus on those?
Well, I'm not going to criticize other companies' marketings. All I'll tell you is that the technical solution concludes that you don't need any computers except your laptop. And so your new job is to go figure out which solutions, when you sum them together, really work. I don't think there's going to be one vendor of cloud computing services. I think there'll be many, just as there are many IT vendors today.
Oh, and do you mind if I quote you on this statement?
You can quote, yes, you can. Everything I do is transparent. We are clearly on the record here.
Yeah. Okay,
Thank you very much.
Hi. So I heard recently from a Rwandan engineer that Google has plans to open up a data center in Rwanda, and he told me that the capacity, the demand for this data center will be about 45 megawatts. And that is equivalent to the total installed electrical capacity in Rwanda today. So it's effectively doubling the capacity. You spoke quite a bit about the availability of information, the availability of data, and the fact that everywhere in the world that smart people exist. So it would seem to me that Google would have an incentive to increase access to this information and to the internet in Rwanda and in other places in the developing world. So I was wondering if Google does have any plans to facilitate the development of rural electrification and rural computing in Rwanda specifically or in other parts of the world.
You're giving my speech internally at Google, so thank you. We agree. The rough argument goes something like this. For the last 40 years, there's been one initiative about Africa after another, and Africa on a proportional basis is worse off today than it was 30 or 40 years ago, especially when you compare it to, say, India, China, the rise of Asia. There are many, many reasons why this is true. So what could we do now that's different? Let's wire the country. Let's wire the continent. So you dig into it and you discover that until maybe last year, there was only one fiber optic cable that served the whole continent. It went from Lisbon all the way down to Cape Town on the left side. I guess that's the west side. After a lot of work, a lot of telecommunications carriers in amazing, amazing acts of courage have laid a couple fiber optic cables now, also one on the east side. And they've now connected a landline cable that will actually go all the way from Dar es Salaam, basically, into Rwanda and Uganda. It's interesting that if you operate in Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda, all your internet was connected by satellite, so incredibly expensive and slow and so forth. And that becomes a pretty big deal if you're trying to build an outsourcing regime. A lot of the Asian countries became successful because they had a lot of cheap labor and they were able to outsource jobs to them. If you can't connect to them, you can't do it because the costs are too high. So we prioritized getting everybody connected, getting those connections in place, and accelerating the information and the production of local information as our key initiatives. With respect to Rwanda, we actually signed an agreement with the President Kagame to actually offer Google's app services, essentially, which are cloud-based. The issue fundamentally in all these countries is the one you laid out. There's not enough electric power to run the data centers. The telecommunications networks are in the cities only. They don't reach the rural thing. And those are systemic issues, and it'll take many years for those to get addressed. And we're going to help as best we can.
Okay, but there aren't currently any projects or programs that you're developing, or are you in the process of developing a project that would facilitate rural electrification?
We've looked at it. We don't do the electrification ourselves, so we have to have the government working with the local providers. One of the good stories is that the local operators, such as MTN and those kinds of guys, have to have their local power anyway for the telephone system. So one of the great stories, and again, we really appreciate how powerful this is that the spread of inexpensive mobile phones in Africa has changed their world in a way that is inconceivable anywhere else. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Dr. Schmidt, thank you for spending your time with us. I'm Miguel Torres. I'm a PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh. Right now, healthcare is very expensive, and this, of course, has driven reform, and there are ongoing efforts. However, one of the challenges is there's a disarray of different components within the the providers of healthcare. How do you see Google being part of a solution to this sense? Do you have any take on that?
You probably know more about this than I, given your research. Let me make the following argument. Imagine if each one of us had the equivalent of a USB stick that had our medical history since birth. And when we walked into the doctor's office, we could plug that in and the doctor could see, oh, I see 10 years ago you had such and such an operation or such and such a disease or such and such a drug. And that powerful servers could go over that data and then make recommendations to the doctor based on the knowledge of that specific correlate or pattern matching around that patient. That's a pretty interesting idea, and it's enabled by the general availability of open patient health records. There's legislation, and in fact, there's a requirement for a standard to come out in December of this year, again, through an office of the White House and a series of legislative activities in HHS, which are trying to standardize on what that format looks like. And of course, we all understand that you wouldn't carry the USB stick out. In fact, that information would be held in some cloud-based service somewhere, so you wouldn't have to carry it with you all the time. So what could you do with that kind of information? Well, not only could you do much more accurate healthcare diagnosis by computer, because you'd have it all in some reasonable computer health record, and make recommendations to the doctor, but you could also do some very, very sophisticated drug trials, because you could really follow the impact of this combination and that combination in things that we couldn't do. So from my perspective, the use of information to do two things is possible, and Google is doing the best we can to help there. One is that more information just empowers the consumer. And one of the voices that's been lost in the healthcare debate is the consumer voice, because consumers are confused and so forth, and they don't really remember things very well, but remember computers do. And then the second one is making that information cycle much faster. Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
My question is about your idea about clean jobs and high-tech manufacturing. What specifically gives the U.S. a competitive advantage over India, China, and developing countries in this sector, given that in India and China and these other developing countries, you can find qualified people who are willing to work for less money, and therefore it makes the products cheaper? What specifically gives the U.S. an advantage in these fields? And do you think that these fields will ever completely replace the high volume of manufacturing jobs that have been lost over the last 30 to 40 years?
That's a very good question. The simple answer is that the only competitive advantage we have in America is the quality of our higher education system and the graduates that it produces. it's already the case that China is on its way to being the world's leader in green manufacturing technologies because they've decided, because they're more or less command and control organized, to invest there. So the only game we get to play, because the people in China and India are just as smart as we are, if not smarter, the only game we get to play is to use the tremendous resource that's represented here, for example, by Pitt, by Carnegie Mellon, and other universities, and it's true throughout the United States. That tradition of innovation, the one that I've highlighted so much, really comes from there. The other question you asked is, over the 30, 40 years, can it replace the jobs? If you look at the history of, a typical example would be the loom in 1860, 1870, if I get my dates right. The development of the mechanical loom ultimately was one of the key components of the rise of the Industrial Revolution that ultimately built things like Pittsburgh and so forth and so on. When they studied what happened with the loom, it displaced a very large number of people who were previously doing it by hand. The bad news for those people was that they did not get new high-paying jobs. Their children did. So the real problem with all of the changes that I'm talking about is a generational one. I'm very confident that an innovation agenda around advanced manufacturing and the things that America does well will replace the jobs that we've lost, for example, high-volume, low-tech manufacturing. But the jobs will be numeric jobs. They'll be the children of the people who lost the jobs. The people who lost the jobs will probably not come back. And that's a real tragedy for them.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming. I really enjoyed your talk. I typed my question into my phone, so if I'm staring at it, that's why.
I think this is the new correct behavior. Thank you for modeling the correct behavior for all of the older people in the audience.
My pleasure. Your vision of a future sort of enlightened by high tech is persuasive and attractive. I think up to this point, the tech sector has enjoyed a lot of good faith from people that has helped it to grow, and it's produced promising results. But do you think that we're at risk of a social backlash founting from the ongoing rumors about cloud computing being dangerous, about companies like Google collecting too much data on us and turning into Big Brother? If you think this kind of skepticism is a real threat to continued growth of tech, how can it be overcome?
I do believe it's a threat. I believe that most of us are ignorant of history and we're too stovepiped to really look at everything correctly. It seems to me that the phenomena that you're describing has existed in America for hundreds of years. That the rise of every technology has brought people who were naysayers. And in some cases, they were genuinely terrified of it. In some cases, they were part of an institution that was threatened by the rise of the technology, and they were doing the best to delay it. And the reason, by the way, it's so messy is that the incumbents fight tooth and nail against the change because it's in their economic interest to do so. It's not that they're bad people, that they're essentially incentivized to fight progress. And what happens is eventually they give up because they retire or their companies go bankrupt or nobody cares anymore. And they're example after example of that. So from our perspective, we believe that the principles of consumer focus, consumer benefit, and transparency will ultimately win over the skeptics. That this is not an industry that operates in secret. This is an industry that operates in declining costs, not increasing costs. And so it's always better next year, which is a nice message from the standpoint of the political operatives and so forth and so on. So as long as the industry doesn't do anything stupid, I think we'll be just fine.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Hello. So no one's asked about the reCAPTCHA acquisition, so I will. So you might say reCAPTCHA belongs to a larger class of services, including Amazon's Mechanical Turk or Crowdflower from Dolores Labs, where there's a large task, such as OCR cleanup in all New York Times. You divide it into very small pieces, and you can distribute it to thousands of people around the globe, and then you aggregate back to accomplish the task. What are your opinions on this general phenomenon? Some people call it crowdsourced labor, whether through reCAPTCHA or more generally.
It's clearly one of the industries of the future, and it's enabled by all the platforms that I'm describing. what I like to think about is, think about a world where you have 1 billion people who have smartphones with ideally Android phones, but there'll be others as well, with very powerful applications running on those smartphones, where computers behind them can both take that information in real time and also do interesting problems. It's obvious, for example, that not only can we, if you wish, and again, I want you to be able to give permission on this, not only do you tell your friends where you are, but we can also predict where you're going using these kinds of algorithms. Now again, you can turn that off. But for a lot of people, I'd like to actually know what is the probability of my friend showing up within the next 10 minutes. Or should I go back and go do something else for a while? So there's lots and lots of applications where you have points of information, people, you have servers, and then you can either disaggregate the problem, which is the examples that you described, in other words, distribute it out, or you can centrally answer it. And this is a problem of computer science, and it's one that I think is a very, very open one for a long time.
Hey, Eric.
Oh, Audrey
Time
says
for one more question.
Okay, maybe we could, we have 4 people, let's do these quickly. I don't want to, Can you just, each 4 of you, tell me your questions, and then I'll try to answer them all at once?
Okay. So Pennsylvania has a particularly urgent economic and environmental interest in the cost of renewable energy generation dropping below that of coal.
Yes.
And Google has obviously been involved in this. And in the name of transparency, I was wondering if you could give us any insights or updates into the innovative renewable energy innovations and investments that Google has particularly made, like high altitude wind.
Okay, perfect. Tell me the next question, please.
The question's about motivation. When a startup is in its initial phases, there's 2 things that motivate it. One is if it fails, it's completely destroyed, it's forgotten about, and if it succeeds, it becomes wildly successful often. If the employees of a startup were to join a big company like Google, both of those motivations are dampened. If they fail, there's their paycheck and their company to keep them there, and if they succeed, the success is dampened because a lot of the credit is taken up by the company. I don't know if Google is less of a place like that. I'm not entirely convinced that problem has been solved at Google in that there's still good motivation to innovate, but I'm sure you're trying to address that problem, and it'd be interesting.
I think I can answer that question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. My question has to do with something you said in the beginning of your speech. You said that growth was driven by technology, private investment in technology. However, in the beginning of the 20th century, it was firms with a broad technological base that introduced major radical innovations. Also, with the current focus on short-term information, firms are much more narrow and specialized. Don't we face the danger of just seeing more incremental innovations instead of big radical innovations?
Okay. And final question.
I really hate to end this on a quasi-confrontational note, but a lot of people have criticized Google's efforts to collect information as Orwellian. How would you respond to that?
Okay, perfect. A great set of questions. Let's see if I can remember. Let's start with green and renewable energy. The goal here is to get the cost of any form of renewable energy roughly equal to or better than that of coal. And we started with electricity. Wind is getting very close. The other ones are still relatively expensive. We are working hard to invest in, Google are working hard to invest in companies which we think will show that way. Even if we don't achieve that objective, and I hope we will, there are so many other things that we can do for climate change, insulating buildings, better efficiency, better energy management, and so forth, that we can make becoming carbon neutral yourself, getting your building carbon neutral, getting your university carbon neutral. All of those things are important. Let's see, there was a question, I'm going to forget all 4, so I apologize. There was a question about Google as sort of Orwellian. And that's easily written, and I understand the concern. Google is run on a set of principles, as we discussed earlier, about information, and I would remind you that if we were to do something evil with all the data that somehow we're getting, people would leave us very quickly, because they would go somewhere else. They would find another choice for or they would just stop using search engines in their entirety. So the real check on our behavior, besides our hopefully good morals and good leadership and good decision making, is our customers would flee. The press would hate us. We would be in big, big trouble. You had a question about the industrial model and the focus on short-term profits and so forth, and evolutionary versus revolutionary investments. In the area of revolutionary investments, innovation leads to both evolutionary as well as revolutionary innovation. Much of what we see today is incremental. If you look at in the computer industry, many of the products that I use today are really a wonderful refinement of something that was pioneered 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And then every once in a while, there's something revolutionary. I would argue, for example, that in its current use, Twitter is an example of something that just sort of happened, right? And there are plenty of examples of that. And so it's easy to decry the short-term focus of the industry, but I would say that long-term innovation is alive and well. The incentives still work, the money can still be raised, and it's a good message. And sorry, and there was one more question which I forgot. Oh, this was the culture question. Yeah, on acquisitions, it depends on what you think people work for. I believe that they work to change the world. Nobody gets up, in my view, and says, "Oh, I'm going to work, and I'm going to go get my so many dollars per day, and I really just wish I didn't work here at all." At least not in my world. People work for passion, and so as we become larger, we try to keep it going. We try to remind everybody why we do what we do, and it works. And I think whether it's a small company or a big company, I think you can motivate around passion and innovation. It produces much better leadership. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for this. Thank you again, Audrey.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.